Hi, I want to talk about how category theory can be applied to scientific programming as well as software engineering more generally. And so when we're programming, we're faced with different tasks like make a triangle, make a square, make a pentagon. And at some point, we recognize some pattern and we try to abstract it. So maybe we'll make some function called regular, and it's just going to take in a number of sides and do what we had done earlier. And that makes our life easier for sure. Likewise, we might be told to make different colors, and we can recognize that there's this sort of common language to all colors, maybe RGB values, and that's going to make our life easier to make that kind of abstraction as well. The difficulty that comes up is that we're then going to have tasks which are more complicated, and in principle, at least conceptually, we understand them as the composite of things we already know how to do. So making a red square, well, that's just a matter of combining make red and make square. But programs or functions that you write don't necessarily fit well together like that. It might not just be as simple as saying make red and make square. Rather, you're going to have to dig deep into the implementation details of make square, and maybe you pass it an extra argument, or you need to expose something that wasn't exposed before by these functions. And essentially, your job could be actually substantially harder, even though conceptually it's simple. Likewise, making a checkerboard with length n, that's going to be some sort of composite of these building blocks, yet it might not be as simple as it is conceptually to say it's just alternating black and white squares with this length. So that's the problem that we're going to try to solve. How do we design our abstractions to make this kind of safeguard ourselves against future problems that we want to solve, and that making them very extensible, let's say. So to review, there's definitely pros to abstraction. The problems are that when we're just programming in the scientific or software engineering context, our abstractions are somewhat ad hoc. And that means that they sometimes don't fit well together. They might be difficult to modify. And that, worst of all, I think in the scientific context, that they're unintelligible to your peers. So you make a bunch of scripts and functions that make sense to you because that's just how you solve that problem. But to someone else looking at your code, it might not be so obvious what you're doing. And this makes communication between scientists very difficult. And what I want to propose is that category theory offers some abstractions that actually do naturally fit well together, and that the scientific workflow can be closer to the sort of conceptual understanding of what we're doing rather than manual low-level programming. And I sort of want to show this with a little figure where we have, our concept, let's say a chemical reaction network, which we understand, we can sort of draw it on a whiteboard. And then there's the actual simulator, the concrete computational content that is associated with it, where you actually give it initial conditions and it will, do an ODE solver. We can code that up. Maybe that's actually doing the full thing or just writing an input for some ODE solver. The challenge with this approach is that we certainly can do that kind of manual coding. The challenge is when our concept changes, when we need to, there's some sort of delta between our new understanding of the world and our old understanding. And we're then faced with a choice. We can either go deep down into our old code and sort of identify what's been broken. And often we just figure it's easier to start from scratch. And that's, I would say, the status quo. Something that is a more promising approach would be that if we had some language to talk about how things compose together, to say that our complicated concept is actually just the composition of some building blocks and they're composed in such and such way. If we explicitly declare that, and now these solid arrows are things that are manual or explicit, we can explicitly declare how our pieces are fitting together. We explicitly declare what those pieces are in the computational content of those pieces. And that really, conceptually should be enough. There shouldn't be anything more manually that needs to be done. The rest should be a very mechanical process of combining our sort of individual building block programs or computational content into a composite where we have our entire thing that we were trying to model as a piece of data, which can be given a semantics. And so, yeah, these dotted arrows in principle should be something that's automatic. The benefit of this explicit compositional structure that we get also comes into play when we talk about how our concepts update. So if we had some language, again, to declare how our concept is being updated in some sense, then really there should be nothing else. There shouldn't be anything else that needs to be manually done to obtain our new model as a piece of data, and also getting the model some computational content. And I guess I should stress that when I distinguish the model as data, what am I distinguishing that from? Well, there's the conceptual model, which is in our head. And there's also just like the simulator. So I think a lot of scientists might think that when they write a piece of code, that is their model. But really having the model as a piece of data rather than a piece of code is going to make it much more transparent rather than something that is very difficult to manipulate. And we'll see lots of examples of this coming up. So I want to briefly introduce what category theory is and try to argue why, in principle, it could form that language on the previous slide, which was allowing us to specify how things are changing or how they are composed of other things. So it's this type of math that focuses on how things are related to each other rather than talking about the things themselves. And the problem that it was trying to address originally was that you had these different branches of math. There were people multiplying 3 times 4 to get 12 over there, and there were people multiplying a circle by a line to get a cylinder in some other branch, and there were people multiplying sets and getting, the Cartesian product. And all these people were doing morally the same thing, but they're really, category theory was invented to be this language to make explicit how they were doing the same thing. So what were they doing that was structurally similar to each other? And so the data of a category has objects, maybe A, B, C, D, let's say, and it has a notion of arrow or morphism. And these arrows connect the different objects. And importantly, we can compose the arrows together. We can say from A to B and B to C, the category needs to tell us, well, there must be A to C, which one is it? And if you're familiar with directed graphs, then you could think of it as a directed graph, but we're going to really focus on the paths of the graph because I can combine them together rather than just thinking of edges. And so because we don't know anything about the objects, we don't have really any subject matter per se, all we can talk about are these shapes of these arrows and these sort of relationships between things we don't know and these relationships which might have some meaning and some context, but we can't really look at it right now. So we might say there's this pair of outward pointing arrows, and we'll call that a span. Or we might say there's a particular object which has exactly one arrow into every single other object, and that's going to be, we'll give it a name called the initial object, let's say. And so there's lots of shapes which the category theorists have discovered over many decades are really interesting shapes that are really good at providing explanatory value in various fields. So I want to say what, in principle, applied category theory is. How could we apply category theory to things that a scientist or a software engineer cares about? And I think an analogy is that would be helpful is the notion of an interface. So if you're not familiar with an interface, it's a way of talking about a kind of data structure without saying what the data structure is in itself. So I might say a queue is something which, and I'm not going to say what it is, but it's something which I can ask what the size of it is, how many things are in the queue. I can check whether it's empty. I can put something in the queue, and I can get something out of the queue. And software engineers have certainly discovered this is a really useful technique for writing code in a way that is sort of defensible. It's preparing you against future changes you might make. So you start off with a linked list implementation, and you discover, well, I need a vector because it's more efficient. And none of your code has to change. You just have to say how a vector is a queue rather than rewriting all of your old code. So interfaces, very cool. In some sense, a category theory is just a particular interface. So you come to the category theorist with your domain of interest. So on the right-hand side, I have some examples of real-world things that might be understood as categories. And if you can tell the category theorist how your domain has the structure of a category, which is to say, you tell me what the objects and the arrows are of the category, you tell me how I get the domain and codomain of each arrow, etc., then the mathematics of category theory, they've essentially been writing code for that interface for a long time, and they're going to tell you lots of interesting things about your category. They're going to say there are lots of interesting questions you can ask, like, oh, well, what does the initial object in chemical reaction networks correspond to. And that's maybe not something you had thought about before. And really importantly, category theorists study the relationships between different categories, which means that by elevating your subject matter into the language of a category, you can then suddenly have a lot of powerful tools to relate it to anything else that can be thought of as a category. So that might be something in the pure math side, which is on the left-hand side, or it might be some other real-world domain that you can now have this really powerful language of relating two different scientists' understanding of the world or different parts of your workflow to each other. And lastly, I want to say that not only is category theory a particular interface, but it's also, in some sense, the study of interfaces in general. As I said, it studies these relationships between things without talking about the things in themselves. And that's really the essence of an interface. And so the ones, the particular shapes that category theorists have given to things that are really interesting to them, the ones they give names to those things, and they do that because they're good interfaces, because they're really good shapes which allow us to understand how things work. And so I want to talk about in this talk how that was a lot of very ambitious claims there of how this math could be useful in real practice, and I want to show examples for scientists not only representing their data, but also how they represent their scientific model, their understanding of the world, and then also how are they going to build simulations from their models. So my working example here, which will be concrete, but the specifics aren't super important. It's just that this was what my PhD was in. We want to do simulations. We want to do scientific modeling of, let's say, atoms in these sort of control volumes. And the main computational tool that gets used in this field is called density functional theory, but let's just think of it as a box, a black box, which takes in a bunch of calculation parameters, and it takes in an input system, which itself has this sort of box defining the geometry, as well as a bunch of atoms in that box. And the DFT solver is going to take in some sort of initial specification of where all the atoms are, and it's going to then optimize those positions. And a natural thing to do is to, we have this scientific task of, okay, well, I want to understand how the world works by running lots of these simulations. And a natural thing to do is to structure our file system around these experiments that we run. So this is kind of like the first thing you try. You say, okay, well, I'm going to be varying this parameter called plane wave cutoff, or PW, and I'm going to just make a folder which varies that value for all of my magnetic iron calculations, let's say. And then you want to vary other parameters too, though. So you sort of put in your directory structure sort of hierarchically. Every level of the directory might be varying a particular parameter, let's say. And this is what we first reach for because it's very flexible, because the file system is very permissive in what it allows you to do. But the downsides are that our sort of conceptual understanding of the world is not made explicit anywhere, so we can't take advantage of it, and we're not even forced to adhere to the sort of conceptual model that we want to adhere to. And another problem is that it's really the wrong structure. Even if we did have good diligence in maintaining the structure, it's putting this arbitrary order on our parameters. And so one step upwards from using the file system is to create a data type representing our simulation. So this would be an example in Python where we want to say that a simulation, well, what is it? Well, it has a calculator, which is our name for a set of calculation parameters, and it has a system. And we might say, well, what are those things? Well, a calculator is, again, this dictionary of parameters. The system has a cell and a list of atoms in that cell. And the cell has some dimensions, has maybe periodic boundary conditions, so that might tell you whether or not you want to interpret the boundaries of either the x, y, or z coordinates as infinitely repeating. So we can do this. We can make a data type to represent our simulation, and now this is nice because I don't need to worry about the file system. I can just throw all my simulations into a big bag of this simulation data type. And then if I want to know, well, what happens if I am talking about bulk magnetic iron and I vary the plane wave cutoff? How does something change? And we can then sort of ask that question. It might be a query that we run on our sort of state of the world. The problem here is that it's really tedious and inefficient to do this querying. So, every single time we want to ask a new question, we need to write a new custom function to do this. We have to worry about serialization, which is essentially writing and reading from the file system. And whenever we write this code to do querying or serialization or do any kind of downstream analysis, it's going to depend really heavily on the structure of this data type, which means it's fragile, because this is sort of codifying, making explicit our model of the world. And the moment that that changes, suddenly all of these scripts that we've written have now broken. So I want to talk about an improvement to that previous slide, which is the notion of a database. So this is something that is very well understood and familiar with in computer science and software engineering, not so much in just ordinary scientific programming. I don't think many scientists are taught about this, but I think it's a really useful abstraction, really practically useful to incorporate into your workflow. So let me try to briefly introduce what databases are. This is a way of also capturing our structure of the model, our model of the world. So before we had this simulation data type, we're going to replace that with this thing called a schema. So a schema is going to have certain tables and certain foreign keys between the tables, or these arrows between them. And these tables can have attributes. And so the idea is that each of these tables is kind of like a little CSV file. And these arrows are basically going to relate the rows in one CSV file to the rows in another CSV file. So it's really a function from rows of the simulation to rows of the calc table. And what does that foreign key represent then? This particular one I'm mousing over, that one is saying essentially, our understanding of the world is that every simulation has a particular set of calculation parameters. And every simulation has a particular system. Every system has a cell. This S times A is this relation between systems and atoms. It is saying that it has a system and it has an atom. And what that means is that, here, this first row is saying that simulation or system one has atom one. Atom one is a part of system one. So in a quite different language, we have now codified basically the same information that was codified over here. And so what have we gained by this sort of swap? Well, it turns out that this data structure in general for any schema of a database is really well understood. We don't need to worry about serializing it. And there's this language called SQL, which allows us to write queries really efficiently and really quickly to get information out of this. So if I want to know, all of the simulations I did that varied this parameter but held those parameters fixed, that is a very natural and easy thing to write when we're working with databases. So that's where software engineering is. And now I want to talk about a further improvement. And this gets into the fact that the problem of that databases really addressed this issue of querying and storage of data. But what do we want to do if we need to do other types of analysis? So there's sort of this uniform solution to those two problems, but now I want to, combine two different models, two different data sets, or I want to merge different data sets, or I want to check for lots of interesting questions I could ask and design a whole pipeline from my data set to a machine learning model, let's say. And so SQL and databases don't naturally address this problem. So if you want to do some real custom programming with this stuff, you're going to have to eventually load stuff from the database back into your program and have the sort of the problem we had before, which was that, well, you need to pick a particular data type to do that. And then all of your code is very, very tied down to that particular data type, and it's no longer flexible. So the solution to this is something called a CSET, which is the same thing as a database in some sense. The idea is that we think of CSETs are a way of looking at databases, but from a category theory perspective, meaning that we understand databases as living in a category. And what that's going to allow us to do is do lots of things. The category theorist has told us, well, if you have a category, you can do X, Y, Z. We're going to be able to do lots of powerful things with our database that we couldn't do otherwise if we didn't think about databases as the objects of a category. And the majority of this talk is going to talk about all the sorts of things that we can do from this perspective. But the actual data of a CSET, or really an attribute, which is an attributed CSET, it basically allows us to also have these attribute values on the tables. That's going to be a big improvement. So I want to, throughout this talk, do sort of head-to-head comparisons, just because I want to really sort of make these points concrete. And so this is kind of a silly example, but your PI might say, I want you to, I don't know if you're really doing, you're running the same parameters for different systems. What if, if you were actually, every single time you ran a different system that you were to run different parameters, maybe that would be bad science. So we want to basically find all these simulations that have the same calculation parameters, but they have different atomic configurations. So, our three different ways we can be tackling this problem are, again, the file system method, the sort of data type method, class-based method, and then maybe this database method. So I'm going to use Python to represent the sort of class-based method. Both SQL and I'm going to introduce as AlgebraicJulia. This is going to be our category theoretic library for doing basically computational category theory. Both of these methods will share a representation that looks something like this, which is essentially how we, in AlgebraicJulia, we actually declare the schema for our simulation type, the one that I showed on the previous page. So given this problem, we might start with the file system-based method. And the problem is never that you can't solve any particular problem with any particular representation. The problem is it might be very incomprehensible and difficult to extend. So in the case of the file system, it might be incomprehensible. I mean, there's not too many lines of code here, and conceptually what we're doing is we're basically saying, our notion of what the same calculator is more or less what our path is in the file system, because the path is basically saying what our calculation parameter is for each level, each directory level is basically saying what a parameter is, except for one of the levels, which is characterizing the system, which is something that we want to allow to be different. So there's some stuff going on there. I don't think it's too illuminating to get into, but the idea is that you can write this code. It will be ugly, and it will certainly break as we want to switch the order of any of these two parameters. The Python code is straightforward enough to write. I mean, we want to do essentially a double for loop, looping through all pairs of simulations. We want to make sure that they're different simulations, but they do have the same calculator and the same cell, let's say. And if we find such a pair, we add it to our results. There's nothing at all wrong with this code other than the fact that it was a bit tedious to write, and it turns out that if our structure of our model changed at all, this is one of the hundreds of little things that would break. Now, to talk about the SQL representation, I don't expect you to be familiar yet with how SQL, the language, the query language works. So just take it on faith that you could write this code fairly easily. You can essentially have this language for answering this very particular question, and it's somewhat straightforward to write. It is a little bit weird that it is an alien language. It's not part of the scientist's conceptual model, at least. And I guess I want to contrast that then with the AlgebraicJulia approach to answering this question. So in AlgebraicJulia, actually, we can, instead of writing a query in some query language, we're going to create a query database. So we're going to create a particular instance on this schema, which is going to represent the question we're trying to ask. And so, what is the question we're trying to ask? Well, we're saying there are two simulations. They happen to share the same calculator, and they happen to share the same cell. And really, that's the essence of what we're asking for. We want everything that matches that shape. And it turns out by thinking of databases as living in a category, so basically thinking them as CSETs, we have a notion of arrows or morphisms between databases. And it turns out that to answer this question we were posed is tantamount to asking for what are all of the arrows from this query database into, let's say, my real database. And by answering this question, this isn't something that we actually have to implement because it's a very basic library function, meaning that really all the work we had to do was to sort of state our conceptual understanding of the question. We didn't have to write code per se. So I should say a little more about what this notion of a morphism is between databases, like what is this actual category of databases. And so the idea is that if we have two instances on our database, so there's each one of these is a particular table, each one of these is a particular table, then a morphism alpha is basically going to be a function for every single table. So there's going to be an alpha simulation, which is going to say, for every simulation in our domain, we need to pick a particular simulation in our codomain. And for every calculator in our domain, we need to pick a particular calculator in our codomain, and so on. And it needs to satisfy some law, which is basically saying that if I, am mapping this red simulation to this red simulation, and I look at its calculator, that needs to be the same thing as looking at the calculator and then looking where that gets mapped. So it's basically this notion of a structure preserving map between databases. And you can see here, this is a visual representation of Q. What we're saying is this is looking for all maps from Q into some database is tantamount to saying, well, I want to get pairs of simulations, which might have different systems, but they share the same calculator and cell. So querying really isn't, I don't want to say querying is the essence of a morphism. Morphisms can be used in really lots of versatile ways, and that's really the hallmark of them being a good abstraction. But it is really nifty that this really basic elemental building block of category theory, one of the most fundamental, the morphism, is exactly the answer to this question that we needed. So this is, again, good abstractions are going to fit well together and be able to be used in many different ways. The last thing I want to talk about data is this notion of data migration. So the idea is that if we understand, this is another advantage to representing our databases as CSets, we have this notion of the relationship between two different schemas. So we can make that explicit with something called a functor, and maybe it's clear from the naming here how these two schemas are related. We're saying that we want to distinguish two different types of cells, bulk cells and surface cells. And furthermore, I had mentioned that our simulation took an initial state into a final state. And so before we weren't really making that distinction. So now we do want to make that distinction. This is very emblematic of the sorts of little changes to our structure of our conceptual model, which are very straightforward and intuitive, yet they can break all of our code if we're not doing it with good abstractions. So the idea is that all we have to do mathematically is say how our schema has changed and how our old and new schema are related. And that really should be sufficient to move any database from the old schema into the new schema. In practice, when we're working with SQL and normal databases, this is actually somewhat of a tedious process that you have to, we'll see on the next slide. But now we can see that, yeah, this is a very common problem of updating our conceptual model of the world. So if we were really tasked with taking our old database and migrating it to a new database schema, then how would we actually address this in the Pythonic world? Well, what we might do is this for loop where we're going to actually query the old database and get every simulation. And we're going to assume that we have some function which actually reads from the database and it converts it back into that sort of class object-oriented version. So if we had that, this getSims function does that, then for every old simulation, we're then going to want to insert a migrated version of the old simulation into the new database. And the question is, how do we migrate a simulation? Well, we know maybe the initial system, but we don't know the final system. And there's a way, but we do know that the final system has the same kind of cell as the earlier system. And I mean, you can do this. The problem is never that you can't do this, but rather this is really tedious and error-prone code that you might have to write. And moreover, it's very fragile. It's only good for a single migration. So moreover, we're going to have to rewrite our new query in SQL for the new database. So I want to really contrast this with, think back of that figure I had early on where we say we want to make our delta as explicit data and have the rest be automatic. So this fin functor thing is going to make explicit the relationship between our old schema and our new schema. And furthermore, we want to make explicit some constraints. So the idea is that, like, what does it mean to be a bulk and what does it mean to be a surface? Well, this is related to the periodic boundary conditions. And I don't want to really get into the nature of these constraints, but I think it's interesting that a homomorphism, the exact same thing that played the role of a query before, a homomorphism is also the right syntax for talking about constraints. So we can do a migration subject to these constraints, and actually there's nothing more. We do this thing called the sigma migration, which is going to automatically move our old database to our new database. And what it is going to do is it's going to do the right thing, and actually for every single bulk cell is going to create an element in the bulk table, and for every surface cell is going to create an element in the surface table. And one of the advantages of expressing our query as just an ordinary database rather than being some string in some other language like SQL is that we can actually migrate our old query and get the same query on the new database. And so this is, I think, really one of the most mind-blowing aspects of this, which is that not only can you migrate data, but because we expressed our algorithm as data, we expressed our sort of model of what we were doing as a piece of data rather than a piece of code, we can actually migrate our algorithms. So this is not just, this is really a lot more general than just migrating databases. So the takeaways really are that we get a lot of advantages from moving from a file system to a object-oriented based approach because we're making our structure of our world more explicit, at least our model of the world. When we move to the database representation, we have a very nice solution for querying and for serializing data. But the problem is that sometimes we want to do more things with that. And working with CSets or ACSets, we can actually do so many more things in a completely schema agnostic way. And all those tools, all those algorithms we're writing are being able to be migrated as our understanding of the world changes. So each case here, our fragility is being decreased. So I now want to talk about actually representing the scientific models themselves, not just the data. And here's an example of a COVID model, which is very intimidating. This is maybe how it looks like to the computer, which is safe to say incomprehensible. But what I want to argue is that in the eyes of the epidemiologist who made this model, this is actually very intelligible, not because what you see on the screen is intelligible, but because they have a conceptual understanding of what they're doing. And really in their head, what they're doing is they're saying, well, actually, my model has maybe 3 major components, in that the model is really, in some sense, the product of those different components, maybe a disease component, a demographic component, and a geography component. And each of those components might be made by gluing together different smaller, simpler models, and that each of these building blocks are actually very intelligible. And the way that they're combined is intelligible. It just turns out if you were to throw that all together, you would get this. So this section of the talk, I really want to focus on these 2 notions of multiplication of models and addition or gluing together of models, and see how that's actually a really good organizing structure for our understanding of our own scientific models. And so the class of models that I want to talk about here are going to be chemical reaction networks. So it turns out these correspond to a notion in computer science called Petri nets. So I'll use those 2 terms interchangeably. But here's an example chemical reaction network, which has 3 different reactions. And the question is, what's the right data structure to represent this type of model? And so it turns out that I've already told you what a CSET or a database is, and it turns out there's a particular schema that is actually well suited for this type of model. It looks like this. It has just 4 tables, and it has 4 arrows. And let me try to give some intuition for what these mean. So we're going to have a table for species, and so every single species that appears in any reaction is going to be a row in that table. We also have a table of transitions, and so there's going to be exactly 3 of those in this case. these input and output objects are relations between species and transitions, meaning every single row in the input table is saying this particular species is an input for that particular transition. And if I were to have duplicates of that, then that would essentially be the stoichiometry. That would be saying that would be the 2 here. And likewise for the outputs. So there's actually a whole library called AlgebraicJulia, which builds off of AlgebraicJulia. And it has a nice, syntax for not only inputting these, it's like a whole library about this particular schema. And it has nice features for, declaring the chemical reaction networks, visualizing them, and you can also see this is really the database or CSV type representation of this exact chemical reaction network. So this is going to be our notion of what a scientific model is for the purpose of this part of the talk, but you could imagine just more generally that we have this flexible language of any type of schema that you could imagine. So I want to talk about first this issue of gluing different models together. And so for this purpose, I want to compare a sort of object-oriented representation of reaction networks. And this is exactly the declaration of the schema that I showed you before in AlgebraicJulia. So this is going to have 4 objects. Maybe we'll give the species and transitions names. We'll have the 4 arrows and give, the names there. So the challenge problem we have now is that we want to write a program that in general will combine different overlapping reaction networks. So as a specific example of 2 inputs we might get, we might be told that one scientist is representing this water, ice becomes water, becomes gas. And this other scientist is maybe using a more, colloquial terminology, and they're going to talk about water getting turned into gas, and then they also maybe have some other reaction that they care about. And so this has it has overlapping species, it has overlapping transitions, and so, as a third party, and you want to use the reaction networks that both of your, colleagues have without duplicating anything. So let's see how we would do this in code. Well, on the Python side, it's certainly doable. It's a little tedious and it might be incorrect. It's not obvious it's correct. The idea is that if I'm merging these 2 reaction networks, well, if I'm merging them, then I firstly start off with a complete copy of the first one. And then all I have to do is sort of judiciously merge in one's species and transitions from the second reaction, so long as they're not duplicates. And so I might loop through the reactions and check, based on the names, whether or not they're an overlap. And then furthermore, if I'm adding in a new transition, then I'm going to need to rename everything so that it's consistent. And so that's its own little tedious but straightforward piece of code to write. So great, it was doable. But we want to contrast that with the more declarative approach, which will be just like how to perform our query, we created a sort of miniature pattern database to represent our query. In this situation, we're going to create a miniature pattern Petri net to represent our overlap. And so the overlapping transition and 3 overlapping species, well, it turns out we can use the data of these morphisms to actually relate, to say, how does that pattern relate to our our leftmost reaction network and our rightmost reaction network. And that is really all the data we ought to be able to specify. I mean, we shouldn't have to say anything more than saying, well, I have this overlap and this is how it relates to the left and the right-hand side. That was basically the input for this other thing. And then we had to write a bunch of code. But it turns out there's this really, really basic category theory notion called a colimit, which I won't really get into the mechanics of the theory of colimits, but the idea is that if you're learning basic category theory, this is really one of the first things you'll learn. And it turns out that this basic notion of a colimit takes in the input of this span, essentially this overlap database and the 2 maps into our real inputs, and it computes something. It computes another database. It computes another Petri net. And it turns out that that is precisely the answer to the question that we were looking for. So we don't actually have to write any code because colimits are a basic library function. So all you have to do is to say, well, this is how 2 things are overlapping to be able to glue them together. And so that's really why colimits are a really useful abstraction to have to structure your code around. The dual of a colimit is a limit, and it corresponds to something like model multiplication. So let me show a very simple example of that first. We want to multiply all the stoichiometry of our reaction network by 2. And of course, we can do this in Python. We can, loop through all of the reactions and all the states and have this function which multiplies all the stoichiometry by 2 for a given state. What might be more interesting is that we can actually have a particular Petri net, a particular chemical reaction network, which abstractly represents this notion of 2. And then there's also this notion of multiplication of Petri nets. I mean, there's a notion of multiplication in any category. And all you have to do really is multiply your Petri net by this particular Petri net. And it does exactly what we want. It multiplies all the stoichiometry by 2. And so we've now sort of replaced code, this algorithm that was represented as code, and now we've sort of got the algorithm as a piece of data. We have a particular database which could be migrated if our schema changed, and it plays this role of what before code was playing. Let me show a more non-trivial example. This is the idea of stratification. So stratification is a way of multiplying 2 models, and it's probably easiest to say what it is by example. So if we have a reaction network, which is very simple, just A goes to B, and we have a reaction network which says solid goes to liquid, and liquid is in equilibrium with gas, what stratification gives us is this 2-dimensional chemical reaction network, where for every phase of matter, we have the reaction happening in it, and for every species, we have all phases of matter with the normal reaction going there. So in general, this is a really, conceptually, a straightforward thing that we want to do when we are building a complicated model that has a lot of symmetry to it. But the question is, how do we actually implement the program which does this stratification? So it certainly can be done in Python, and I'll show some code which does most of it. I sort of lost patience by the end. But the idea is that we do want a double for loop. We want to loop the reactions in one reaction network with the species in the other reaction network. And for each of those, there's going to be a new reaction. And we have to do that. We have to do both sort of cross products. And there's a lot of, fussing about names and, but it's doable. It's just not clear if it's correct, and it's certainly fragile code if our data structure for a reaction network were to change at all. And all I want to say is that the process of doing this multiplication, the stratification, is really just as simple as defining these databases that have 2 maps into a common base little Petri net. So this is kind of dual to the notion of an overlap, which maps into both of our inputs, but rather we have our inputs mapping into some base. And I think limits are a little less intuitive than colimits, so I don't expect, I don't expect it to be obvious to someone looking at this for the first time why taking the limit of these 3 Petri nets is going to give us the stratification that we wanted. But I think with a little familiarity, a little bit of practice, that this is actually something that you could do on your own, and that is actually allows us to, just as simply as before, do this multiplication in a very declarative way that is, again, just in terms of data rather than actual code. So the idea is that gluing and multiplying models can be made sense of in any category, in particular the category of CSets. And I want to say that this is somewhat similar to how we conceptually think of our models, yet when we are programming in Python, let's say, we don't have the ability to make that explicit, and we can't just say, well, give me the product of these 2 things, or the colimit of these things. And that means that we have to do a lot of things sort of manually at a level of abstraction that's very far away from how we think about things. And so these are basic things that can be implemented once and for all databases. And then the scientists shouldn't have to think about that. They should just be thinking declaratively. And this part of the talk about models, I really only got to talk about constructing models, but there's lots of things that we can do with models that are also interesting, and we have blog posts to talk about that. But I'll just move on to the final section very quickly to talk about simulations. So our basic philosophy is that you should never have to write the simulation as explicit code. Rather, you should declare a model, which is a piece of data, not a piece of code, and you should be able to compile that to a simulation. And another way to think about this is that code is a good category for semantics. You want to interpret things as code. But code is actually pretty lousy for syntax because I can't manipulate code as easily as I can manipulate graphs, let's say, or databases. I can't take limits and colimits of code in any straightforward way. And so we want to do those high-level operations on our models. Therefore, our models should be these, let's say these CSets, as opposed to actual code. The model as code is very problematic. And as an example, we have, I tried to find, the simplest, advection diffusion solver in Python. This is now doing this continuous time solving of this PDE. And obviously it's many files that are very long and it's not straightforward, but you get a sense of this is the real key aspect of updating our matrix with respect to a time step. And it's really a mess. It's not clear, if I want to change this by adding a gravity term, for example, it's not clear where I would change this code. It's not clear, does the order here matter? What parts need to be modified, what parts correspond to sort of the geometry versus the physics versus just purely an implementation detail that has no physical meaning and therefore I am free to change, but maybe it's really important for performance. So there's just a lot of chaos involved in these sort of like really hardcore solvers, which I experienced during my grad school, which was that people are very reluctant to ask new questions that would require changing a solver because you're very scared to change these old solvers written 30 years ago because you don't understand them well enough to change them confidently. So I'm going to gesture at some work done by some colleagues of mine, which is the idea that we can actually represent multiphysics with these little diagrams. So I can sort of characterize in a very diagrammatic way fixed diffusion law, or the conservation of mass, or the superposition of different forces. And once we've sort of codified our model in this more graphical language, we can actually do a lot of this is a much better syntax for our model because now I can do things like glue these different models together. So this is sort of a composition pattern as an image. This corresponds to over here where this is the code corresponding to this sort of composition, which is saying, well, I've got these three submodels and I want to join them along these shared variables. And the result of applying this composition to these sort of building blocks is going to be, you get some bigger multiphysics model, but I sort of understand it compositionally. Furthermore, I can really cleanly separate the syntax and semantics, where I know what corresponds to the physics, I know what corresponds to the geometry, and then I can assign maybe matrix operators to each of these sort of primitive symbols which appears on these arrows. And that really should be sufficient to automatically generate an efficient solver. And so this is code which will then compile to Julia's really efficient numerical computing libraries, which will then actually do this kind of multiphysics simulation. But now we've made our conceptual model much more explicit. And the result will be, we can do these advection diffusion things, but if we need to change anything about the physics, it would be much, much easier to change our conceptual model than if we had written it like in that Python version. The last type of model I'll talk about is agent-based modeling. So this is kind of a discrete time analog to before was a continuous time simulation where you have things in certain positions and they're updating according to rules. This might be an example where I have wolves and sheep, and the wolves eat sheep and the sheep eat grass, and they're all living on a graph, and they're moving around the graph and turning and eating each other and reproducing. So the idea is that if we were to represent this in Python, we could create a very class-based representation of our understanding, and we can definitely write sort of this for loop, which will go through a bunch of time steps and for every character do their actions. I want to contrast that. So this is a lot of code, and it might be surprising that we can actually capture this notion of things updating and deleting data and adding data, and we can actually capture that in a purely visual way that doesn't require any code. So there's two aspects of that. The first aspect is that we can have these wiring diagrams which capture the control flow of a program, and then sort of our primitive building blocks might look like this. These might be a little pattern. Think of this as like a pattern on the left-hand side and a replacement on the right-hand side. So these patterns and their replacements are just instances. They are just CSets themselves. So here is, saying I have a sheep and a wolf, which happen to be on the same location. That's sort of what I've drawn as a cartoon here. And what we want to replace that is just with a wolf. So we want to really capture the rule that a wolf can eat a sheep if it's on the same location. And really, there's no more code that needs to be written. Once we've said the pattern and the replacement, we just say that, okay, well, there's a relationship between those two things. And now I can actually apply this rewrite rule to a concrete instance, a real simulation. So to get into more detail about this, to really contrast this notion of rewrite rules, I'm going to switch back to the PetriNet example. If our task was to take a reaction network and sort of write a function which does this rewrite rule, which is to, this one I've drawn here will merge two things together, and it will delete something, and it will add a new transition. It's really hard to sort of write out the logic that does this generically. I mean, I tried and I got not very far into it. And it's not clear if it was correct, and it's very clear that it's wrong if I were to change this pattern at all. So I wrote a very special case code just to do this particular rewrite, and it's very tedious and very difficult. In contrast, in the AlgebraicJulia approach, you simply declare the pattern, you declare the relationship, and it turns out that there's no code that needs to be written. The code that does this rewrite, will work for any schema, it will work for any rewrite rule. So the idea is that merging, deleting, copying, adding, these are all things that don't require code to be done, but this is a really powerful sort of primitive building block that allows us to do a lot of programming-like things, but without having to write actual code. And so we can, one application of this is making very discrete time simulations. So I want to wrap up. I want to remind us of these sort of two figures of the sort of relationship between the whiteboard, our conceptual understanding, and the computer, that we can actually automate this pipeline from the whiteboard to the computer without having to sort of completely separate from the whiteboard, write a piece of code that we hope is connected to our conceptual understanding, which then needs to be, which is easily invalidated. The example of updating our conceptual understanding explicitly such that our model updates automatically, this was also a big theme of the talk. And I want to say sort of that, we want to automate science, but the reason why it's very hard to do things automatically in science is that, in my experience, is that when you're trying to, for example, use someone else's data set or use someone else's code, that there's often a lot of unclear context and assumptions that are built in, and people are very react justifiably defensive to this, and they just basically only trust their own data, or they only trust their own code. And I think this is a step forward towards making our models explicit such that they can be trusted, that they are intelligible to us instead of really these unintelligible spaghetti that you just have to, that might be wrapping in some assumption that you don't want to make. So I think that this notion of formalization of our conceptual models is really going to create the possibility of automation in science. And I also want to conclude that category theory is useful. I hope I've made that point, that it has these very general notions, which I'm listing here, which really make sense of, can be made sense of in any category. And not only is that really a powerful tool that you have this very common language which works in a really broad variety of settings, but they all naturally fit well together. They're sort of designed to fit well together. They're kind of all built out of the same building blocks of limits, colimits, and morphisms. And we can use this essentially to replace a lot of our code with high-level data. And so to conclude, there's lots of resources. So I hope that you check out, we have a lot of papers that might be accessible to scientists. Blog posts are also done pretty conversationally, and all of our code is open source. So we're always happy when scientists play around with it and try to see if it's applicable to their use case. And this talk itself is on my website in case you want to click around and look at the links. So thank you.